Welcome to Design Your Life in Business, the podcast for leaders by Bright Mind Consulting Group. We give you the necessary tools to help you become the architect of not just your business, but your life too. I'm your host, Jevon Wooden. Hey, Dr. Patrick, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Jevon?
I am doing fantastic. I've been excited for this conversation ever since we scheduled it. For those who don't know, she is a professor at UH in the Doctorate in Business Administration program, my first professor, really. And she's done a lot more than that, though. She is actually the associate dean as well. So we are going to talk about all of your accomplishments and all the greatness that you are, Dr. Patrick. And for respect, do you mind if I call you Vanessa for this conversation?
Not at all, by all means.
Awesome. Perfect. So let's jump right into it. First question I want to ask you is, who are you? Who is Dr. Vanessa Patrick?
That's a great question. I think I wear many hats. I'm a mom. I'm a wife. I'm a scholar. I'm a teacher. I'm a cook, a chef. These are the different things that I like to do. But I think like everybody else, I have a lot of different interests. So that's who I am, like a whole bunch of different things.
And I love that you kind of tied it all together. And now you mentioned you're a scholar. So you've done a lot of research. You're very accomplished. You are, so far, don't tell anyone, but my favorite professor. But you're also the associate dean of a top performing university in the University of Houston. So what motivated you to pursue a career in academia?
I've always been scholarly inclined, and I love creativity and building things. And I love ideas and knowledge. And so the academic career really aligns with my skills and with my interests. So it brings together this wonderful world of discovery and invention, but also knowledge creation. And I also think that's so important, not only to have knowledge, but to share knowledge. And so one of the things I enjoy the most about my job is teaching students like you. I come to life in the classroom. I love to share my knowledge. I'm somebody who reads broadly, and I kind of pull all of that information to benefit the students. And so it's the kind of career that's very holistic, and it can tap into different skill sets. And so on one hand, it's extremely creative when it comes to kind of idea generations, but it's also very precise when it comes to running specific studies, writing up results, contributing to knowledge in a very precise way. So I think it's just kind of a wonderful career for me.
Absolutely. And you definitely come alive. I mean, when I could be tired and come in that classroom, and I'm happy when it's your day.
Oh,
So
thank you.
I really appreciate bringing that energy and really being able to explain some complex topics in very understandable ways. So with that being said, our listeners are mostly business owners or leaders, and they don't really understand like all that goes into the academic side. We think it's just some type of thing where you're sitting in the background just typing and reading all day, writing papers we can't understand. So can you tell us a little bit more about what are some of the obstacles you face into this journey of academia and how you overcame them?
Yeah, it's not an easy profession, Jevon. It's really not. It's actually really hard to succeed in this profession because there are very high barriers to entry. The doctoral programs are extremely hard to get into. So just the fact that you got into a doctoral program says something about your intellect and your capability. It's not easy to get into the program. Once you're in the program, you're operating at the very highest level of knowledge, and you're in the most refined intellectual circles. Like the people around you are super smart. And so in many ways, it's challenging to just keep up with the knowledge because knowledge is changing so fast and it's coming to you from all these different directions. And so just staying abreast of stuff and having a clear idea of what you bring to the table in terms of your specialization and your area of interest, and being a super focused about developing that expertise. That's all challenging. And having done all that, publishing papers is really hard. So I've obviously published a lot of papers in my career. But I can't say a single one of them was easy. It's never easy. It's a long process from beginning to end. It requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of creativity, a lot of hard work. I don't do late nights, but I do very early mornings. So for me, a lot of early mornings.
I can relate to that. Y'all hit us hard on that first semester. So there were a lot of
Oh,
early
yeah.
mornings for me too.
So it's definitely been had its challenges. And sometimes you do wonder, wow, couldn't I have an easier job than this? But on the other hand, it's very fulfilling, intellectually fulfilling. It's also very driven by self motivation. So you have to have the intrinsic motivation to want to do this. Because
Absolutely.
if you don't want to do this, there are lots of other things that one can do. And so that's the thing. Getting into academia, getting into an academic way of life is definitely a lifestyle choice.
Yes. And your research, you kind of intertwine all of what you just said beautifully under the guise of marketing. When I first saw that was your background, you would never know it because you were able to kind of talk about so many different things, like with depth. It wasn't just
Yeah.
surface level stuff. So my thing is, how do you retain all of that information? You're reading hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of papers a year. You're writing so much, you're researching. Like, how do you retain all of that information?
So it's definitely a process. There's a steep learning curve, and you just become better at it over time. And your brain just kind of figures out how to sort information, what to retain. It's actually a deliberate process. Like you
Mm,
have to intentionally create those structures, that network in the brain. So I always talk about kind of when I think about how knowledge is structured in the brain, you need to understand a few things. Like I always encourage my students to understand what sort of learner they are and to feed their brain in the way that their brain best learns.
mm.
So, for example, if you're someone who's a visual learner, then you should be watching more videos and looking at PowerPoint slides as opposed to reading. Some people are verbal learners and they much prefer to learn verbally. You can also listen to audio. So, like for me, I listen to nonfiction, I read fiction. So I've got
Makes
kind of the
sense.
modality that works for me. I process information much faster, like nonfiction information, facts and books and stuff I like to listen to. Whereas fiction, I just like to lie in bed and enjoy reading. So it's a
Get lost
completely
in it a little bit, right?
exactly. So
Yes.
I think knowing yourself and being able to kind of learn in a way that matches your best way of learning is really quite very, very important and
Yeah,
something I've
absolutely.
learned over time.
And I've learned a little bit of that in our
What
modality.
about you? How do you learn?
And I'm still figuring it out. And I think that this program really helped me. I'm a reader. I love to read. I love the feeling of pages. So I like physical books, including yours, right? Which we'll
Thank
get
you.
into. But I just feel like there's something about, I get lost in books, even business books,
Hmm.
because I'm just curious, right? So I
Yeah.
want to learn about what they're talking about. And I'm not the type of person to read cover to cover. I'll find what I want to learn and then I'll
Mm.
move on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I found has worked
That makes a
best
lot
for
of
me.
sense.
And there was something, I forgot the name of the paper, but How to Learn, you
Yes.
provided a ton of information on that. And that was very helpful for me, breaking it
Yeah.
down, skimming through at first, and then coming back in academic
Yeah.
paper, and then like trying to understand what information you really need to understand and retain. That was key, right? Because those academic papers, they can be brutal. I don't know if y'all have ever read one of those, but man, it's words you're like, man, I thought I was pretty sharp guy, but I don't know what the heck they just said.
And you'll be so surprised and proud of yourself, Jevon, in a bit, like in a year. It's going to be like so easy peasy, just get through them. And I think that's something to look forward to.
I'm holding you to that. No, it has become easier. Even this semester has been
I'm
easier
sure.
because we're breaking it out. Like you said, it's a method to it. And once you
Yeah.
figure that out, it's like cracking Pandora's box. It's a great feeling. Now, you focus on some of what we're talking about here. It's not pleasurable to always read those things, and they're not always designed the best, but they follow some type of methodology. So you talk about like psychology, pleasure, inclusive design. What got you interested in that? And then how do you apply that to your research?
So before academia, I worked in industry and I worked in advertising for the most part. So I've got a mixed background. I have a bachelor's degree in microbiology and biochemistry with a specialization in genetic engineering. So I've got a very, very sciencey background. And then I have an MBA and I worked in advertising and brand consultancy. And while working in advertising and brand consultancy, I realized that there are so many really interesting questions about consumers and why they buy and the decisions they make and what motivates them. And that kind of lent itself into my research streams. So I like to describe my research as two sides of the pleasure coin. On one hand, giving in to pleasure, the beauty of life, the beauty of things, aesthetics, design, luxury goods. So I study all the consumer motivations in the pursuit of pleasure. But on the other hand, we also have to balance that by restraining our pleasure, by exerting self control, not overindulging. So, I do a whole bunch of research also on self regulation, personal mastery, and personal development and growth. And so, those two kind of things, I see them as two sides of the same coin because that's life. Life is about pursuit of pleasure as well as restraint. And so, I study both of them in the consumer context.
Now, your book kind of talks about this, right? It's called The
Mhm.
Power of Saying No. And congratulations on that once in a while. If you have not picked up your copy, I suggest you pick it up. The Power of Saying No. Can you tell us why you decided to write on the power of saying no and how you kind of weave in the science of how it says
Mhm.
no that puts you in charge of your life?
So I wrote the book based on my own research. So I did some research articles on a concept called empowered refusal that I then translated into the book. So essentially, it's based and backed entirely by science. And why I wrote the book was really because, and I talk about this in the book, my own personal experiences with the inability to say no. And I realized that people really struggle with saying no. Saying no is
Yes.
one of those really hard things to do. And if you think about it, Jevon, in order to focus on what you want, you do need to say no to everything else. There's always a trade off. And once we master that trade off and be able to say no more easily to the things that don't serve us, we're going to be more successful. And I realized that there's a lot of books on success and a lot of books about goal pursuit, but nothing about how to say no to the things that don't matter, which
Mhm.
is why I wrote this book. Because there isn't a science based method before my book to be able to say, hey, if you're struggling, if you're a people pleaser, if you're someone who struggles with saying no, how do you go around building the skill set that you need? How do you develop the competencies that you need to be able to say no more effectively?
And you know, I have to ask you to dig into that a little bit. Don't you ain't got to give it all. They got to get the book, but please tell us how to say no, especially for the people pleasers out there.
Oh, yeah. And it is a tough, and I'm sure I shared this in the book. I've done surveys of people, and people, regardless of whether they are men or women, regardless of whether they are the boss or they are the subordinate, saying no is hard for everyone. And it's largely because we are human beings and we have been socialized to believe that saying no is something that will hurt the other person or damage our reputation or damage our relationship with the other person. And so we are very reluctant to say no. So I start out by basically laying out the problem, which is what's the problem with saying no, that boils down to the fact that we are human beings who struggle with this issue. And then the key things about saying no, the most important, what makes an effective no is the fact that you are able to say no, but you are also able to maintain a good relationship with the other person. You are able to secure your reputation as a good person, even though you are saying no. So, given that, I identify what I call the art of empowered refusal, ART being the acronym for the three steps you need to
Mhm.
master in order to be able to say no more effectively. So, these three competencies or these three steps are A standing for awareness, self awareness, understanding yourself, your priorities, your values, what you care about, and where you struggle. Like, what are the pain points? Where do you struggle with saying no? So that you need to begin with self awareness by looking inwards. But once you've developed this deepened self awareness, then you need to develop structures and put structures in place that allow you to say no more effectively. So I call these structures, a lot of people call them boundaries. In my book, I call them personal policies. Personal
I like that.
policies are the simple rules that we set up for ourselves that shape and our actions and decisions. So when we have personal policies in place, we are much more effective in saying no because we've already thought about what we care about, what these structures are. And once we know what the structures are, it's easier to say no. It just facilitates the process. And the third step is the T, which I call the totality of self. Saying no is not about just saying no using the word. Saying no is a whole body experience. You have to use your voice, your gestures, your words, your body language, all to come together to be able to say no more effectively. And so I talk
Yes.
a lot in the book about the struggles that people have. And what I think helps people, based on what I've heard of feedback from the book, is that they can see themselves in some of those examples and then realize the mistake that they are making and rectify it. So it's a very implement what I wanted the book to be, and I think it is. It's like
It
very
is.
practical
I can
and
confirm.
super implementable. Like you can take those ideas and run with them immediately. They don't require a whole bunch of preparation. You can actually like really implement them right away.
And I actually like how you formulated the book, right? Although it's based on research, it's not heavy, right? It's
Oh
very
no.
easy to understand what you're
Yes.
saying. Very well written. And another thing I want to bring up about that power of saying no, the design piece, the psychology piece. I just want you to kind of dig a little deeper in, like
Yes.
you mentioned that it's the whole body, whole person. So tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about that. Like, because a lot of people just struggle. They hear you, but they're like, man, I still can't do it. Right. So
Yeah.
what do you say to them when they're still struggling?
Right. So I think what I find in talking to many people and working with many companies, individuals, as clients, as students in my class, is that I find that people think that this is a magic bullet, that you read something and it's going to work just because you read it.
Mm,
It's never like that. It's a process. So you have to kind of really think about and start small. Think about one area in which you want to make some changes. Identify how would you like this to be the way it's not right
mhm.
now. And using the steps in the book, really craft those personal policies. Is really practice. It takes some time to practice empowered language. So, one of the things I talk about, for example, is simple stuff. Simply reframe how you talk about your no. When someone asks you something, instead of doing the default thing, which is what all of us do, which is the default, I'm sorry, I can't because, and you give an excuse.
Yes,
Instead of saying, I can't because, look at how you can invoke a personal policy. What I show in my research is the simple switch, the simple reframe from I can't to I don't makes a huge difference in the way you communicate. So if you say, I can't eat chocolate cake, people are most likely going to ask you why not, what's one slice of cake, right? But if you say, I don't eat chocolate cake, it stems from something that's within you. It signals your identity. That's the science. The science is the use of language, the use of body language that invoke your identity. Communicate, this is who I am. And once you communicate, this is who I am, you get less pushback from others.
absolutely. And I like that you mentioned that it actually, one of the things I found and the reason why I really, really enjoyed the book was I found that when I started saying no without that excuse, and I just said, I don't want to, I don't know, you don't owe them
Mhm.
anything, especially if it's not something that's really going to contribute to anything, like they're asking you
Yeah.
to go somewhere. But one of the things I really like about this, it shows why saying no helps, right? Because when you set those personal policies and you convey them to the other person, then they can also start saying, okay, let me try that, right? And you may be the one that sparks it to make it okay to not be a people
Yes,
pleaser, right? So it's really
absolutely.
something that pays it forward in a way that's protecting you as well.
Absolutely. And I think that these are things that it's not that hard to start doing. You just have to start practicing it. So instead of coming up with an excuse, I love the fact that one of the things that Oprah's a huge fan of saying no. And one
Mhm.
of the things she always says when she talks about this is no is a complete sentence. You don't need to give the excuses. You don't
Yes,
need to give people long explanations. If it's a no for you, it's a no for you.
absolutely. I believe that too. But it took a while to get to that, especially if your personality, so to speak, like training
Right.
yourself to do it. But practice makes perfect. Well, practice doesn't
And
make
I
perfect,
think
but practice gets you ready for it and used to it.
And I think what I say in the book gives people a lot of motivation to
Mhm.
do it by telling them some really practical things. So, for example, recognizing the trade offs. When you recognize, when you say yes to something, that you might have to say no to something more important.
Absolutely.
People recognize that immediately. If you say yes to this extra work that's going to make you stay up at work late or go to work on the weekends, for example, think about what you're giving up. You might be giving up time with your family. You might have to give up your child's piano recital or soccer game, which you don't want to do. As soon as you start thinking about the trade offs, then you realize how important it is to say no to the things. The other thing I'm very pragmatic about in the book is this idea that if you say no, people just go to the next person. You
Or
are
figure it out
not,
themselves, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
this idea, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm not indispensable. It's like, if I say
that is
no,
so
I
true.
just move on. And that's a humbling thought. But I think it also frees you from the burden of saying yes. Because people very often think that, oh, they are asking me, they thought deeply about it, and they really, really need me to do it. Most often, that's not the case. Most often, people just need something done. They ask you, if you say yes, now it's your problem. And
Yeah,
I talk about
I
that
see it all the
very
time.
pragmatically. And I think that that message resonates with a lot of people because it's true.
My wife, she says something that I really like when someone asks her something and she doesn't want to do it. If she says no and then they keep bothering her, she say, "What would you do if I wasn't around? Or what
See,
would you do if I wasn't here? Go do that." Right? So, and I love that
exactly.
because it forces them to think like, what I do if you can't do it, right? Because you still have to do whatever you wanted to do or it's
Yeah.
not happening. So
Yeah.
that's so true. And we also have to be careful, especially in the business side of things and even in your personal life. You can enable people if you're always saying yes to them.
Mm,
You just become their
yes.
default and they don't put
Yes.
any brain power into figuring it out for themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And people do get stuck in that rut where you keep on every year taking on the same responsibilities. And one of the things I've learned, Jevon, is that if you do say yes again and again to things, people think you like it. People
Yes.
think you want to do it. And so they think, okay, she's saying yes every year. Probably she just loves doing this. So I'm just going to keep asking, not knowing how frustrating and resentful you actually feeling. And
Yes.
so if you really are resenting doing it, then it's better to say no and nip it in the bud.
From the jump. Yeah, I mean, we see that in relationships all the time, right? You tell your spouse that you like that spaghetti they made, they start making it all the time, thinking that's your thing. And then eventually, years down the road, you're like, I just got to be
Yes,
honest, I really
yes,
didn't
yes,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah, throw it into the
yes.
dog, so it really applies to every aspect
It
of your
really
life.
does.
So it just pays to be honest and just do it tactfully, right? Figure out what that means
Absolutely.
for
And it's so, and since you have a lot of business people, it's not only about interpersonal, like with friends, even as a business person, even when you're making decisions in a business context, learning to focus on the strategy of the organization, learning to focus on the things that you need to get done in the organization means that you do need to say no to other things. And I was recently talking to a client who I was consulting with, and they were telling me about, but we want to do this, 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 and this, and this. And I'm like, you can't. You have to recognize that if this is your focus, then you have to learn to let the other things go. Being able to say no to the things that are nice but not crucially important is critical for business success.
Because you don't have infinite resources, time, money,
Exactly.
people. Listen, you have to
And then
prioritize.
people get burned out and they
Yes.
don't know what's really important to you.
Yes.
So, singularity of purpose and having a very clear focus on what is important for the business means you put everything in there and focus on that and let everything else go. Like Marshall Goldsmith in his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, talks about the importance of having a do not do list and how important the not to do list is as important as the to do list
For
or
sure.
even more important.
For sure. Keeps you guided. And I tell my clients that same thing, whether it's coaching or consulting. It's like when you say it, you said it earlier, like pretty much you got to know your values, know what really is
Mhm.
important to you, and then just make sure what you're doing is aligned with that. Cause it's so easy to get derailed. And I think
And
saying no to yourself was really
yeah,
hard, right?
but
It's
it
like,
starts with you. If you can't say no
yeah.
to yourself, it's going to be really hard for you to say no to other people and to say no to other opportunities in business.
Yes, for sure. Now, let's talk about this pleasure side. How did that apply to the pleasure side? Because I know a lot of people listen, like, yeah, I know I can say no to them, but when I want that Louis or I want that
Hmm.
Gucci, it's
Yeah,
hard. So,
yeah.
talk about how that
So,
impacts on the pleasure side as well.
absolutely. I think that's one of the biggest things to have the self discipline to be able to control our own impulses, our own urges, our own desires. So, the research I've done on the empowered refusal also deals not only with other people, but also in your own self regulation. We have to have kind of guidelines and parameters by which we operate in order to have a disciplined life. So we need to understand for ourselves what do we want to achieve and what do we have to do to achieve that. So, for example, if you have class tomorrow, you cannot spend all of tonight binging on Netflix till 3 a.m. because you have to be on the ball tomorrow morning. Just recognizing yourself, your limitations, what you should and shouldn't do is what self regulation is about. And so, what I'm really interested in is self mastery. Self regulation is basic day to day stuff. How do you operate? How do you eat healthy? How do you exercise? Self mastery is taking yourself to another level, pushing yourself to do things that you didn't think you could do,
Mhm.
pushing yourself to learn, pushing yourself to achieve, pushing yourself to produce stuff that you didn't think that you could do, but what you would like to do. That requires an extreme sense of mastery, sense of control, sense of discipline. You have to build that capacity. And in order to build that capacity, you really have to get good at saying no to yourself. So while it might be fun to do a whole bunch of stuff, sometimes you got to say, I'm really got to do these things if I want to achieve X, Y, Z.
And I see that a lot. Like that, you're speaking my language because that's really a lot of what we do with emotional intelligence, right? You get the self recognition first,
Yeah.
and then you get to that self mastery or self management and build that up. But if you don't recognize yourself, it's hard to do that. So I really advise the listeners to take what you're saying and put it into practice. Like really start to get to know you and your
Hmm.
tendencies. So you have a sweet tooth for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
Start putting into practice ways that you can defend against it, right? Be
Yeah.
proactive versus being reactive. And that's going to help you say no a lot easier, right? Ask yourself, like, what is this worth? If I eat this piece of cake, what does it really get me? Or if I
Yeah.
stay up watching Netflix and I have class in the morning and I'm going to be tired and then I get a bad grade. So you really have to weigh those types of things and see,
Yeah.
why is this important for me?
I don't know whether you remember this bit in the book when I talked about compassionate self control.
Mhm.
So, the way I describe my self control research is in terms of compassionate self control, in the sense that what we've shown in our research is deprivation doesn't work. So, you don't say, I will never watch a movie, I will never watch Netflix, I will never eat cake, because that's not how we are structured. We
Right.
need to have personal policies around that. So, for example, I don't watch Netflix. I don't watch more than 2 episodes. That's a policy. So once 2 episodes are gone, you switch it off. Having a quota. I don't drink more than 2 glasses of wine at a work event. Those are the kind of
Like it.
parameters, personal policies that you set about. So you're not saying you can't drink at all, or you can't watch any Netflix, or you should never eat cake, because that's not sustainable. You should think for yourself, what works for me, and put a boundary around it and put a personal policy around it. That allows you to manage yourself much more effectively over the long run.
Absolutely.
Deprivation works in the short run, but you cannot sustain it. So you should allow yourself to be thinking about what gives me pleasure. And let me have a little bit of that, like one piece of maybe dessert once a week. Okay,
Yes.
dessert once a week is reasonable. Dessert 7 days a week, it's not reasonable.
We see that a lot with like New Year's resolutions, which is why I just
Oh,
can't
yeah.
stand when people set them, right? They
Yeah.
try to like shift their whole life
Yeah.
in a day, like soon as the clock hits. That's impossible, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is you end up binging whatever you were depriving yourself of.
Yeah.
And then it's really hard to get out of that, right? Because now
Yeah.
you're
And
self-loathing and you're starting to beat yourself
yes.
up, you lose
Yes.
confidence. It's just a snowball
Yes.
effect. So I'm glad you said like set boundaries where you can allow yourself to have fun, right? Allow yourself to be a human, but also allow yourself to achieve your goals, right?
And do it
Wisely.
and pay attention. Do it while looking at inside yourself. Look at what your
Mhm.
tendencies are. So, for example, I'm a morning person. Because my brain works really well in the morning, I will never watch anything in the morning. I prefer not to even have meetings in the morning because my
Yes.
mornings are reserved for writing and creative work. In the afternoon and the evening, when I know my brain is kind of tired, that's when I do the things that don't require me to have like the mental energy that I need. And so just like setting yourself, so in the afternoon or in the early evening, if I want to watch a show on Netflix, sure I can if I want to, because I've done work all day and my brain is tired anyway. So learning about yourself and setting up these kind of guidelines to be able to regulate yourself without deprivation is really what science says is the best solution.
Yes. I'm the same way, by the way. Once you learn that, like when you operate your optimal times and all that
Yeah.
stuff, and we all have different times. Some people
Yes.
work very well at 2 p.m. where I start crashing at that time. So I
Mm-hmm.
got to take my break around there. So yeah, it really is a powerful tool just to know yourself, have pattern recognition and all these other
Mm-hmm.
things that you're talking about. So
Yeah.
I advise you all to go get that book and read about, and then read some of your research because you've talked about this at length. And also, she's one of the most cited people that I know. So I don't know how much weight that holds, but you have a high H index. I talked about that with Dr. Pavlov in our previous episode, but she is very well cited, and it's for a reason, right? It's not because her stuff is trash, it's because she talks very, 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 very powerfully about this pleasure center, about marketing, inclusivity, all these different things. And I can actually understand it. So I think you'd be able to understand it too if you're listening to this. So before we go to our by design segment, Dr. Patrick, I would love to ask you to just enlighten us, right? A little bit. What would you tell us if you had us just sitting in front of you right now? What would you say about getting started with these boundaries if they don't learn anything else from what we just said?
I think that self mastery, and with that, the learning to say no is something that all of us can learn. It is something that no matter how much you think you're a people pleaser, you can learn the simple steps to become more self focused and more empowered. And what I love about that is by just investing in this learning how to say no has a spillover effect on the rest of your life. Because when you learn to say no, you feel more confident, you feel more empowered, you feel better about yourself. You're more likely to advocate for yourself, to negotiate on your own behalf, to ask for what you want. So I think that by investing in this small skill can have this ripple effect, the spillover effect that can affect a whole bunch of other things in your life and make your life so much more meaningful and better.
Yes, indeed. So I want you all to try that, say no, and then let us know how you felt when you did it. And you'll find out how to connect with Dr. Patrick at the end. So, and keep listening. All right, we're going to shift to our by design segment where I ask every guest the same 3 questions. Are you ready, Dr. Patrick?
Yes.
All right, let's do this. First question. What has been the hardest part about designing a life and career you don't need a vacation?
Planning how to spend my time when I'm so curious about so many things. When I'm reading one thing, how do I not feel tempted to switch to something else? I'm constantly juggling what I shouldn't read, which book next. And I think that designing your life seriously, like I think about my day and I design it. And sometimes I have the trade off and I have to make like, today I can't read this book, I have to read that book kind of thing. That's hard
Man,
for me. I wish I had the ability to do all.
I'm glad we had this conversation because I realized how similar we are. I struggle with the same thing. That's awesome. Number 2, what is the best lesson that you've learned on your journey?
The power of personal branding. I think that we are all a brand. And let me back up. A brand is a set of associations. When you think about Nike or you think about Porsche or you think about Mercedes or you think about Louis Vuitton, as soon as you say these brands, there's a set of associations that get activated in your mind.
Yes.
People are like that. As soon as we hear a person's name that we know, we have a whole set of associations that come across in our mind. And I think that we are our own brand managers. When we show up in the world, we show up as a brand that people are going to associate with. And to show up with authenticity, reliability, consistency, and likability is so important to be a solid brand that people can rely on and want to engage with. And I think that that's been my lesson. I've learned that people do think about you in a particular way, and you build social capital with every interaction you have with people. And so having that strong brand is so helpful to get things done.
So true. And I see your brand working for you all the time on LinkedIn. So you definitely have a strong brand.
Thank you.
And that's the power of it, though. And people will speak your name in rooms that you're not even in, right?
That's what reputation is.
Yeah.
Reputation is what people are saying when you are not in the room.
Yes, indeed. That is a major key right there. The last question is, what are 3 tools or tips that you would recommend just in general? You can say it about life, about business, whatever you like to talk about.
Tools or tips. 1, read widely. 2, learn every day and be curious. Like Eleanor Roosevelt said that challenged us to learn something new every day. And I take that to heart. And my third one is be grateful. Every morning I get up and I spend 3 minutes before getting out of bed on the edge of my bed, really stopping to think about all the things I'm grateful for. And I think it sets such a positive tone to the rest of my day. And the gratitude, and research supports this, by the way, gratitude has this amazing effect of multiplying the goodness that happens in your life.
Absolutely.
And so taking a moment to be really grateful for what we have is something that's a life lesson that I definitely like to pass along.
Yeah, see, I do the same thing. Like I say a couple things that I'm grateful for that, and it's been proven that it increases your happiness quotient. It's very
Absolutely.
important for sure. And you can deal with stress a lot better than
Oh,
someone who
yes.
just has that negative outlook. So,
Yeah, it builds a
yes,
buffer to all the negative things in your life when you actually protect yourself with all the positivity.
yes, indeed. Well, Dr. Patrick, it has been amazing. I really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thanks so much for coming on Design Your Life and Business. How can the people connect with you?
So I am on LinkedIn. I have a website, vanessapatrick.net. I'm also a coach and a speaker. So if you have any corporate events, I'm happy to chat with you all. We have a website called thewellbeingspeakers.com where you can contact me and my colleagues. So I look forward to hearing from people.
Absolutely. So reach out to her, grab that book. The links will be in the show notes. And remember, everyone, keep ascending. Design Your Life in Business, the podcast for leaders, is brought to you by Bright Mind Consulting Group. To find out more about Bright Mind Consulting Group and how you can become the best leader possible, visit brightmindconsultinggroup.com. Make sure you search for Design Your Life in Business on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Bright Mind Consulting Group, we cannot thank you enough for listening.